Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with the final end of project wrap-up video for the 1/6 scale scratch-built Cadillac Gage M706 V100 Armored car. And I'm really glad that I am done with this project because that name is really long and a bit cumbersome to say, but regardless, let's go ahead and get in on this one. For those of you who are tuning into this video for the very first time, I want to say welcome. And this video here is actually the end stone or the end cap of this particular project. This model is the subject matter of its own build series that's found on the ECA channel, and you can see what this thing looked like from the very beginning when I first took this project on, all the way up through the course of production to the very point that we have here where the model is fully completed. I recommend checking the series out in order to get an idea on what it takes to build a 1/6 scale model like this one here from start all the way to finish. For the rest of you who have been following this build along from the beginning, I first want to say thank you. And also, the model, as I mentioned in the previous video, is now fully completed. In the previous video, I mentioned the last of the details that were needed to have been added to the surface in order to get it to the complete state that we have here. And as I also mentioned in that video, with the model fully completed, I always like to take the model outdoors for some nice outdoor shots, and I'll film just, one last video to end the project, and that is the video that we have right here. Which, considering the age of the starter model, as well as also the condition that it was originally in, having it in this condition now outdoors is definitely something that is very appreciated. The model that we have here is built for my own personal collection. It's not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these videos, I frequently take on commission build projects for models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. However, this build here is a bit different because this is a scratch build, and scratch build projects are not models that I offer commission build services in, just because of the time required to put one of these together, as well as also the costs that are associated with that. So this one here is a literal one-off, and I'll be going over that in a little bit more depth as the video goes on. Plus, I'll probably be making an announcement towards the very end of this video, so stay tuned definitely for that. To kick this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the Cadillac Gage V100 Armored car, or as they refer to it as the Commando. Which you have to admit, it's a really sexy name for a armored car. Regardless, this vehicle was developed by the Cadillac Gage company on their own accord in the early 1960s. This was really the accumulation of several other designs that came out before this that date back to probably the mid-1950s time frame. But in 1962, this was the design that was finalized and actually went into production by Cadillac Gage. One thing that's interesting about the development of this vehicle is, like I stated before, this was done independently by Cadillac Gage. This was not as an answer to a program by the U.S. military, or there wasn't a contract or nothing along those lines. This vehicle was totally done independent in its own vacuum. The idea was to sell this vehicle on the open market for other country militaries to adopt and utilize for their own forces. The V100 was touted as being an affordable light armored vehicle that was suitable for security roles as well as also just light armored car duties. These vehicles were equipped with many off-the-counter and off-the-shelf components in order to keep the vehicles easy to manufacture, more affordable to manufacture, and also easier to keep and maintain in field. For instance, the engine was just a standard off-the-shelf Chrysler V8, and some of the other suspension components were, again, just borrowed from other military vehicles that were in production at that time. These vehicles were also fully amphibious, which again aided to their capabilities and made them that much more attractive for potential buyers. For armor protection, Cadillac Gage invented this new armor known as Catalloy. Catalloy was basically impervious to just about all small arms fire, and the material can be made very thin and also very light. This made the vehicle very lightweight, which gave it its amphibious capabilities and also gave it some pretty good speed. Another interesting aspect of the design is with the design of the tire. When the vehicles first came out, they were intended to utilize the standard off-the-shelf USGI truck tires. However, this is a weak point. Of course, all armored cars have a vulnerability with the pneumatic air-filled tires, and when the vehicle is a combat vehicle, the idea that a tire can get deflated with the hit of a bullet or any sort of shrapnel is problematic. So the designers at Cadillac Gage decided to go ahead and tackle this. And what they came out with was a tire with a equally as sexy name known as the Commando Special. Commando Special tires had a very thick wall to them that was also made out of a composite of very cutting edge at the time materials. These tires were able to even stop rounds dead in their tracks, or the tire, if punctured, was able to self-seal, and this allowed the armored car to take rounds and also get out of the problem area at speed for a good distance until finally eventually the tires would leak out. Another benefit of the tire was that it was designed to aid in its amphibious nature. The thread pattern was similar to what we see on many construction vehicles like graders or front-end loaders come to mind, and with the shape of these chevrons over here, this actually helped propel the water and actually gave the vehicle a little bit better maneuverability when doing its amphibious operations. For armament, this is where the vehicle became very adaptable. The vehicle came in a multitude of different configurations, from a version with an open top roof that can house a mortar. Another one had a pulpit that had several different MGs in place. But in regards to this particular example, it had a single, fully revolving, fully enclosed and armored turret. Turret was known as the T50 turret and was designed by Cadillac Gage and also sold separately in case anyone would like to add these to any military vehicle that they so deemed fit. And actually the Australians took them up on that offer and fitted these to their M113s. Regardless, the T50 turret can mount just about any MG that the customer so chose, be it two M73s, 1919s, or even an M2HB. If it could fit, it could be fitted in place. Eventually, the unit would even be tested with such things as a minigun, which is really, really cool. But oddly enough, they never fit on the Stoner 63, which was a weapon system designed by Cadillac Gage, well, by Eugene Stoner specifically, but it was offered by Cadillac Gage, and they even had one for a vehicle-mounted role with the use of solenoids. But yet, for some reason, they never paired the two together for one reason or another. Regardless, the T50 turret, again, was an iconic feature found on this pattern of vehicle. At the same time, in the mid and late 1960s, the U.S. was involved in the Vietnam War, and one problem that the U.S. military was having was with attacks on their supply lines. So, in order to keep fire bases and other sort of camps fully equipped, this was necessitated with the use of, well, supply lines and logistics. And these vehicles were mostly comprised of soft skin, deuce-and-a-half trucks, and things along those lines. Obviously, these are very vulnerable to ambushes, and this happened quite a lot. The MPs and security forces were doing their best in order to thwart this. However, at first, they were ill-equipped with vehicles that could handle this job. They were originally taking M151 mutts, adding armor plates to them, as well as some extra MG pintle mounts, as well as also taking standard deuce-and-a-halves and doing the gun truck thing to them as well. Although this did have some success, but there were several limitations with specifically the M151 Mutt, and it was just in a role it was not suited for. Well, at the same time, you had this vehicle here, which was literally on the shelf, and it was the perfect vehicle at the perfect time. These vehicles were then adopted quickly by the MPs and were used to great effect during the remainder of the conflict. As the vehicles were being utilized in field by the troops, Cadillac Gage was getting active feedback from these exact same individuals, and they were able to take this feedback, incorporate it, and make improvements to the V100s that were on the production line. As the war went on, more and more modifications and enhancements were made to the vehicle, eventually perfecting it really in the mid-1970s. The vehicle was a very successful vehicle in that it was produced in decent numbers and was widely marketed to both law enforcement and military sales, and a good number of them were utilized for both of these roles, and many of them are still in service today. As a quick recap, this model here is scratch built, however, it's not initially scratch built by me. This model is also quite old. The hull itself dates back to about the year 2000 or so, and at that time there was a individual who was a 1/6 scale customizer and collector, and he had the idea to produce these 1/6 scale V100 Armored cars as a fully built and fully assembled model. He had the idea on having an assembly line of them and, producing them in decent numbers, and then offering them to the 1/6 scale marketplace. This type of an idea was one that was quite commonplace back then and was attempted by a number of individuals for different types of vehicles. At this time, the 1/6 scale hobby was in its infancy, and 1/6 scale military vehicles were really far and few between. And to put things in perspective, at the same time, you had the 21st Century Toys Kittenkrad, the Schwimmwagen, SOTW Jeeps, and the biggest, most coolest item that was about to drop at this time was the 21st Century M5 Stuart. So there was quite a popularity and demand for 1/6 scale tank vehicles or military vehicles as a whole, but there wasn't really anything out there on the market, specifically anything that was really affordable. You had some 1/6 scale RC tanks coming out of Eastern Europe, but those were very expensive at the time and were also radio controlled. But outside of that, the market, as you can see, was very, very barren. Another thing to consider is that manufacturing technology, or access to manufacturing technology, was a fraction of what we have compared to today. 3D printing was absolutely non-existent. CNC was obscenely expensive. So if you were going to go down this avenue of trying to make a model like this, you were going to have to basically handcraft everything from the hull to also all of the detail components. If you did not have access or the capabilities of doing things in cast resin, you were also going to be on the hook to fabricate literally every single fitting by hand. Something else that a lot of builders would do back then was to try to take a shortcut by utilizing some off-the-shelf equipment and utilize it for a detail fitting or component on one of these models. Specifically on tank tracks, I would see the use of conveyor belts, or I would also see the use of vinyl cabinet trim that was cut and then, utilized to give you a track band. For cars or tank wheels, I would see the use of RC car rims and tires for this application, and this model here was actually using similar techniques. So the builder originally had the idea of building a number of them. He built in total of 3. The models are all scratch built out of 1/8 inch styrene plastic and are then just cut to shape and glued together. The V100 was a good choice because the vehicle isn't overly large, and with the angles it kind of makes the model somewhat easy to assemble. For the tires, he was going to utilize large RC car tires and rims, just off-the-shelf stuff from, I guess, 1/10 or 1/8 scale vehicles, and he was able to fully complete one of these examples. However, just like what typically happened with many people who attempted this type of a business, he quickly realized that even though the vehicles seem easy enough to do on paper, when you're trying to do a number of them, the complexities definitely add up quickly, and finally, so does the cost. Eventually, for the person to go ahead and make these in a profitable manner, the price was going to supersede exactly what the market was willing to pay for a model like this at that time, so he abandoned the project. However, he was able to build 3 of these vehicles, one of which he was able to fully complete, build, and weather, and he has pictures of that vehicle on the internet, on the old Green Leader 21st Century action figure fan forum. That was a thing back then. The model was actually, I believe, sold on eBay, or so he told me a little while ago. So somewhere, someone out there has that exact example. And then the other 2 examples just wound up in a partially finished state. One of them he built as a Raccoon City zombie patrol vehicle, and the other one was just never fully finished. Well, the models then went into storage, and then we fast forward our clocks to the year 2019, or about 2020 or so. At that time, I actually went to a military vehicle show and I filmed a walk-around video of the Air Force version of this vehicle, which is the M706 E2, if I'm not mistaken. The video was posted and was actually pretty popular, and after seeing that vehicle in person, I thought, you know what, this would actually be a cool vehicle to actually make in 1/6 scale. And then, magically, I get an email from the person who built these models and had 2 of them left in his shed. And he contacted me saying, hey, I saw that video. Would you mind, doing one in 1/6 scale? I got 2 of them over here not doing anything. If you want one, hit me up. Of course, I was not going to turn that down. So I went ahead and he sold the model to me for a very good price. The model came in and you can see what it looked like in the original condition. This model was the Raccoon City zombie patrol vehicle that was painted in black that I referenced before. And that was then built up and rebuilt up into the configuration that we have presently. The model's hull was modified and improved. Even though the builder did a very good job with the overall scale and shape, he had some areas that could have been improved slightly, and those improvements were made, and I go over all that information in the videos that are found on the playlist. For the model's detailing, this is something that I was going to take advantage of the new technologies that I mentioned before. In the past, for me to make a model like this, I would have to scratch build all of the details and cast them either in resin or fabricate them out of lengths of metal strip. For this model, however, I was going to do something different. Rather than going with those type of conventional building methods, I went with utilizing as much 3D printed components as possible. Again, all of this information is shown in the video series. The use of 3D printed components first gives a better quality product, I find. There are limitations to what you can do when you're scratch building parts by hand and also using cast resin. And the model is also a fraction of the weight compared to one of my other counterparts that are using the, well, more traditional old school systems. All of the detail components that were used on this model here are listed on the ECA catalog and are offered for sale for anyone out there who's interested in working on a V100 and want to flesh it out to the condition that we have here. From the wheels to the lights to the turret, basically everything on this model here is listed on the catalog. And when I mean that this vehicle has little cast resin parts as possible, I'm not kidding. The cast resin components would include the exhaust manifold system. This one here is a modified set from my German SDK V222 armored car. I fabricated a set a number of years ago, and that set is actually also listed on the ECA catalog specifically for the 222. Well, the exhaust manifold on the V100 was similar in geometry with the way the pan exhaust setup is, and to save a little bit of time, I just simply repurposed the exhaust parts for use on this model. Of course, they were heavily modified to make them more appropriate for the V100. At some point, I am going to tool up a proper set that's dedicated for the V100, and they will be a single 3D printed piece that just drops in place, but that's something that's neither here nor there. The other component that is an old school legacy item that's still cast is the MP65 antenna base right over here. This is made out of cast rubber, and this component, again, has been on the catalog now for about 10 years or so, and doesn't really have an end in sight, as the part, the master is excellent, and the mold is holding up great, and also it casts in rubber so that you can actually have the piece flexible like it is on the real unit. The last 3D, or I should say the last cast resin component that we have here is the MG mount that's right here on the rear gunner section. This here is a scrap off-cast pintle mount that I had on hand. It was my older Jeep pintle mounts, and the piece was a half cast, so rather than having it languish away in my spare bin, I simply just went ahead and incorporated it on this build. That set, by the way, has also been retired with a 3D printed set, so this one here, it's about time it gets utilized for something. The very last cast resin item that's found on this vehicle is the shovel, specifically the head and the handle section. These are copies from the 1/6 scale Dragon Jeep shovel that were supplied with that kit that I built about 10 years ago. And when I was building that model, I said to myself, I need a lot of American shovels for all the tanks that I build, so it would probably be a good idea I go ahead and make a copy of it and utilize it on my own personal builds. Because this item here is a copy, it is not listed on the ECA catalog, but I am in the process of designing a brand new shovel in CAD, and that's going to be a 3D printed component and supplied with the tool sets like I referenced in the other video. Outside of those mentioned components, everything else is made out of 3D print, or if it isn't and it's made out of cast rubber, it's made out of a 3D printed master. For the 3D prints, this model here basically utilizes a multitude of different medias for different reasons and also for different applications, and the materials that are used would be, for instance, ABS, which is FDM printed. We have SLS nylon. We have resin prints in one type of resin or another, and we also have a type of rubber printing which was utilized for the tires themselves. I was fortunate to have access to not one but two V100 Armored cars used for reference on this build. I already mentioned the Air Force one before, but there was another one that appeared at the same military vehicle show about a year or two later. This one was this exact configuration with the T50 turret. I've actually been in contact with that collector, and I'm always bugging him to take pictures of certain key areas of the vehicle in order so I can flesh out the model like the way you see it here. With his detail photographs in hand, as well as with my detail photographs in hand, because I was able to have the opportunity to see his actual V100 and crawl all over, getting as many photographs as I humanly can. I was then able to take all of this intel and use it to craft up and design all of the detail parts that you see on this model. And that was basically all of the work required for this model, or I should say the majority of the work was just sitting on a computer late at night or early in the morning and, you know, working in CAD, designing the various detail components. The other wait time was just waiting for parts to be manufactured from any of the number of vendors that I used to do the prints of one flavor or another. I tried to get my own 3D printer and print some parts. I got an Ender 3. Unfortunately, after several botched attempts, my Ender 3 became airborne in frustration, and I quickly realized that, yeah, I'm good at designing parts, but actually setting up a printer and producing them, yeah, I have no clue what I'm doing with that. So I'll just hire people that are way more knowledgeable at that, and I can just concentrate on what I'm better with. So regardless, that was really where the majority of the time was spent on this project. Once I had parts in hand, they were basically installed within a day or so. So it was actually fairly quick in that regard. Of course, it is noteworthy to point out that other contributing factors that add to the build duration would be the need to focus on commission build projects, as those are for customers, and those do have priority over my own personal builds, as well as also saving up the funds required to purchase said parts that are needed for manufacture. Another thing I want to mention is that this model here is static, and the reason why I'm mentioning that is when I first announced this project, a few people were disappointed that I didn't RC convert it. And in fact, one person even said that I was crazy for not attempting an RC conversion on this project because it can be done, quote, relatively quickly. Well, the reasons for not RC converting it are actually pretty simple. First, I'm not really into RC. This may sound surprising because I do a lot of RC builds on this channel, but RC is not really a main interest of mine. I do, mess with it, but it's not really something that I have that much interest in, believe it or not. The other reason is with the way the model is fabricated. For me to RC convert it, I would basically have to take the model down even further than I already did in the beginning of the project, to the point where I'm basically scratch building an entire new model, and at that point there, it's just not worth it in my opinion. Another reason why I didn't RC convert has to do again to what that commenter mentioned. He said to RC convert, it shouldn't be too difficult to use an off-the-shelf 1/8 or 1/10 scale truck or a crawler suspension or differential. And although that is doable and is actually probably the best way to do it, regrettably that detracts from the look of the model because those pieces look nothing like the ones on the V100 Armored car. So utilizing those would have detracted from the detailing, and to me that's just not something I'm interested in. Me personally, I'd rather have a static model that is super detailed opposed to a radio-controlled model that the details have to be watered down in order to compromise to make the thing work. But that's just my personal opinion. The final reason why I didn't RC convert has to do with budget and time duration. Whenever you RC anything, the prices will elevate on that build, as well as the complexity. Because of all the mechanical systems, the complexity will go up, which will require more time in order to build and complete. And when you have a ton of projects that are lined up, you need to spend both of those adequately. With all that out of the way, let's go over the model's detail, fittings, and features. And as I generally do in these videos, we'll start with the suspension and the running gear. So the running gear that you see here is all 3D printed, as I mentioned before. And they have also been modified because these pieces were originally FDM. And in the videos where I go over the suspension, I show the modifications and some of the techniques added to these sections here to improve them further compared to the way they were fresh from the printer. The V100 is a monocoque type system, so we don't have a under frame, and it's actually pretty flat on the bottom section of this vehicle, as you could probably glimpse from the camera angles that I am getting. It's actually quite funny. If you ever saw the movie RoboCop 2, they do have a Cadillac Gage V100 in that movie. It's labeled with OCP markings on it, has a slightly different front end, and it was used to crash into Robocane. And they actually use a large model like this for the stop motion, and to give the prop guys credit, they actually did render out the bottom plate pretty well considering the type of vehicle it is. So yeah, it was actually kind of funny watching that movie the other day. I'm like, oh yeah, I see what they did there. Regardless, the vehicle does have a unique suspension in that it utilizes both leaf springs and shock absorbers. And because of the leaf spring system, I wasn't able to make this one have a functional suspension. Leaf springs are a bit tricky. They're the one things that you really can only do one way, and that's utilizing a real leaf spring suspension on. Another interesting thing to point out about the V100 is that the way it is steered. On the vehicle, it actually has, I guess the best way to put it is power steering, where the clevis is controlled by a hydraulic ram that is in a armored box that you can see right over there. And that hydraulic ram is used to actuate this long clevis, and that clevis is used to pivot the steering left and right. The model does have functional steering, and it is tied into this clevis system over here, so it doesn't animate when the wheels are pivoted. The next thing I want to mention are the tires. The tires on this model here would have been literally the hardest thing to have been needed to have been fabricated with the old school methods. And fabricating a tire is actually really hard. It's actually one of the hardest things to scratch build because of the thread patterns that are required. For this build here, I worked with a designer coming up with the component that you see presently. The tire is 3D printed, but it is not 3D printed in a standard hard material. It's actually a semi-rigid, rubbery type media. The tire is a two-piece assembly, as I go over in the video where I show the assembly, and then the entire tire is then coated with Plastidip, and that gives you the dull rubber look that you see here, which absolutely looks awesome now that the model is fully completed and is being photographed and filmed outdoors. The rims themselves also came out excellent. You can see the valve stems that I mentioned in a previous video, again just giving it that much more detail fidelity, and the valve stem rubber top section is actually made out of, well, real rubber, and the way you see it is how the material actually is, and there's no paint to paint it because, well, it's rubber. The wheels, of course, are able to roll, and this model's actually been somewhat tricky to film because this thing just wants to get up and roll on me, and I am on a slight incline here on my driveway, so yeah, it's been a little challenge trying to keep this thing from, you know, heading off downhill. But regardless, the model does roll very well. Moving our way to the side door, you can see what the details look like fully completed. The bottom guard over there is made out of brass, and it is just soldered together in the old school format. The door, of course, is fully functional. This one is actually held in place with the locks as it is on the real vehicle. Obviously, this model does not have any sort of interior detailing, but all of the interior hatches are appropriately detailed and weathered out. There is a headrest that slips into this section over here. I have it. It's on the inside of the model, and give me a second. I'll go ahead and slip it on. There we go. With the part fitted in place, you get to see just how much extra detailing it gives. Unfortunately, the reason why I do not have it fitted on all the time is because on this one here, I have a slight error with the hatch, and the production units are actually going to have the hatch be slightly larger, which will be actually more accurate. At the moment, you'll see that if I try to close the hatch, it's just going to make contact with the vehicle's doorway over there, and that's something that is going to be fixed in the production unit. But again, you know, for literally a rough prototype, it actually turned out very well. And for the uses that I'm going to be utilizing this model for, just having the piece be removed just prior to the hatch being closed works perfectly fine for this example. But rest assured, the ones that are going to be listed on the catalog are going to have this with the appropriate height, and the piece will be able to close with the headrest present. But one quirk about the hatch on this model here is with this locking latch right here, it tends to want to slip down like that, and when I'm trying to close it on the model, it always gets in the way. So I either have to like carefully rig it so that it closes before the piece swings down, or I'll have to use some kind of high-tech expedient field tool here to go ahead and get the part closed or out of the way so that the hatch can properly close. There we go. All right, carry on. So we have this drainage box over here. Again, a bit of detailing that is listed on the ECA catalog. All 3D print, as are the welds. And we also have here the rear engine hatch. This too is fully functional. However, to open it, you have to do just like with the real one, where you have to get access through the engine compartment. And the engine compartment is held in place again with these lock latches. So you open these up. This guy here can then open up. And with these open, you can then actuate the latch and open your engine compartment. Again, nothing on the inside, not on this example anyhow, so it's just going to be remaining in the closed state. I just had a little bit of plastic sawdust in there. No biggie. As for the engine hatch itself, they are fully detailed. This one here, known as the Bakota, does have the appropriate grills, and the grills are with the appropriate dimensions and shape. They are not just flat grills, they actually have a bend to them, which hopefully you can see here on camera. And again, it's just, little details like this I was able to get off of the real example that I use as research. This over here is used for a padlock, just to prevent anyone from getting access to the engine that really shouldn't. On this area here, we can see the antenna base mounts. The V100 has 3 total. We have a large one in this section over here that houses the spring antenna base. And then we have 2 other options. Generally, there would be about 2 radios fitted in place, or from what I was told. And this one here, we have the MP65 that I referenced earlier. This one here is just simply blanked out, and you can see that by the plug that we have right there on the inside. These wells here, again, are another detail component found on the ECA catalog, and contain the wells as well as the plugs. Moving our way back to the front takes to the side view mirror. It is fully adjustable, as I mentioned before, and one thing that's really cool is the mirror that we have right over there, which again is something that you can really take advantage of in this larger scale, and it really just makes the model look all that much more realistic. We have the fuel filler cap right over there with its chain retention system. Of course, all the visors are present on this model. The visors have a Lexan panel for the use of the lens section, and it just again lends itself for some excellent accuracy. This is, of course, is really appreciated on the turret that I'll get to momentarily. With the way the hull is on the V100, it is welded in a few sections, and you can see exactly how the panels would have been shaped, formed, and then welded in place. The weld beads are sculpted in my usual format, and once done, really give the model a lot of detail fidelity. Of course, the V100 is known to have its hull sections overlap, so we have these overhanging lips that you see over here, and these are present on basically all of the hull sections, from the top plate when it goes all the way around to the rear, and also on the front section over here you get to see how it has that overhang on the sides as well as also on the front lip. Same is also true on the back. Moving to the rear of the vehicle takes to the tail lights. Like I stated in an earlier video, the V100 had several options available for tail lights. I rendered this one here with the earliest type format, where we just have the standard USGI post-World War II cat's eye. Note on this one here, it is present with the blackout lens fitted in place, as would be on the real one. These are 3D printed in both standard nylon material, SLS, and for the lens cap, it is made out of the translucent resin HD material for great detail fidelity, but also because it's translucent, you can actually fit a light bulb, or I should say in these days an LED, so that you can actually have the thing function. The ECA catalog has not just this set present, but also has a couple other sets, one of which being the later pattern of USGI taillight, and then there's another one that even has a shroud on it. So, I basically covered all the bases. Also found on the back here is the tool rack. I went to more depth about this in the previous video, but here go the tools all fitted in place with their webbing straps and their spring clips all in their locations. The jerry can, the V100 was gasoline powered, and here we have the gasoline jerry can, USGI of course. Painted red, as this was commonly done in the post-war era. The bottom here we have a tow hitch, and the tow hitch is HD printed and is actually fully functional. As you can see, it locks in the open position and then clamps down. Once down, it doesn't open, so you can actually have this thing towing something. Although I don't recommend it, this is HD material, and it's a bit on the frail side. One thing that's cool is that it is a single printing, in that the hitch itself is all a single printing. No assembly is required. And this one here is a double interesting piece because it's specifically for the V100, where we have the clip plate, or I should say the safety chain plate. And this is present on post-World War II vehicles like the M151 Mutt. But what's also unique is that on this one is specifically for the V100 because it has this bracket, and the bracket is, as accurately as I can possibly render it, thanks in part due to the real examples that I had access to. Includes the fasteners, includes the welds, and also includes the appropriate geometry for the bracket itself. Also on this area over here, you get to see some of the details on the lower hull, like the drainage plugs for the engine compartment, as well as also the other drainage plugs, which are found on the lower portion here, that are used to drain any sort of water that enters into the crew compartment. And with the camera readjusted, these are the two I was referring to. One down here, and one directly next to it, and there are more found on the front under hull sections. Moving back up takes to the hatch area. Before I do, I just want to mention that overhang present that I was referencing before, and also you can see the power cable for the taillight. Nice bit of detailing, and it's one that just makes the model look all that much more polished and complete. We also have here the lift ring, which is unique to the V100, and this one is a set listed on ECA, and it gives you 4, 2 for the back, 2 for the front, and you'll see what they look like momentarily. As for the hatch, this opens up, and this one does have its headrest present. This one is listed on the ECA catalog, and the back again is held in place with the actual latches. And it's really advantageous that the latches are actually used to secure things in place. On most tank models, it's not really important, although I have done it in the past, but on this one here, it's really required because of the angle here of the rear plate. Gravity tends to not want to be your best friend, so this thing will always want to open up. Also, at this time, you get to see how the counterbalance spring works, and it actually is functional on this piece here. This spring is slowing down the ability of the hatch to swing open. On the flip side, literally on the flip side, you can see how the other counterbalance springs here work, as well as with the 2 connecting arms on the rear hatch. I do go over more depth on the development of this piece because there were about 2 or 3 different patterns of hatches on the V100 on the rear section over here, but that's better discussed in the other video. Regardless, the ones here are fully functional, as are the side hatches, as one would also imagine. As for the opposite side, there's nothing really much to go over here. It's literally just a mirror image found on the unit that I referenced before. Which brings us directly to the front. So on the front of the model, you can see the remainder of the details, such as the winch compartment hatch. This one here, it is static because of the way the plate was adjusted. There was no real good way to add the winch interior. So this one here, the winch is just in a static format. And this part, though, is listed on the ECA catalog in a functional format. On the bottom portion that we have right here, we have the actual winch. The winch is fully detailed with its interior detailing, and this can be seen in better depth in the video where I go over the installation. But here you get to see the winch detailing in its final format. Note, the rollers are actually fully functional. And you can see the winch spool with the cable all where it needs to be, as well as the winch eyelet. The winch cable itself is all made out of real metal cable. It's picture frame cable that was just spooled up and then weathered to the following format. The eyelet is soldered together to brass, and so the unit is very strong and should be more than suffice for lasting a lifetime. Continuing upward takes to the headlights. This is probably one of my favorite parts to detail on the hull. They were really fun to design. They are basically the exact same type of headlights that you see on vehicles like the M60 and the Sheridan, as well as the M48 A2. And, it was really fun to make them as detailed as possible. The piece is a multi-part assembly. It is all hollow on the inside with individual cavities. So if you're crazy enough, you can actually have individual LEDs on the inside to replicate the headlight, the blackout light, as well as the other lights that would be present on this component, which there are about 4 if I'm not mistaken. And we also have here the little indicator light right there, and I go over the minutia and details that are definitely found on that in the other video. But you can see the power cable right there. It emerges from the small light and enters into the back of the housing, as it does on the real units that I was using as reference. And on this one here, in addition to the blinker light, we'd also have the siren, and the siren was another really fun component to detail out because I had a real one on hand, and it's actually in my collection. And the one you see here is literally the one in my collection, down to the very last hollow rivet that you can see right there with the light shining through. The inner baffle details are also present as well, because why not? The brush guards are also 3D printed and are set on the ECA catalog, and they do come with the meshwork that you see present on this example. The mesh is aluminum varmint mesh, so it is the perfect scale and thickness, and also you get the appropriate weave detailing that you just wouldn't be able to get if the part was 3D printed, or photo etched for that matter. Moving to the top takes us to the rear. We'll move our way forward. I already talked about the exhaust manifold earlier, as well as the hatches, but on the rear gunner's hatch area over here, this again is fully functional, and the springs are actually in use. These springs keep this thing closed. Let me just temporarily remove the 1919 for the moment, just so I can open this guy up. If I let go, it just closes like a mousetrap, as you can see. To keep it open, we have these latches right here on the deck, and they are fully functional and do the job. Let's go ahead and leave those in the open state. As you can see, the latches are fully functional as well, as I referenced before. And one cool thing I always did like about this build is if I hit that little latch, thing just closes shut on me. No fuss, no muss, unless that stupid lever wants to fight me. Regardless, it goes in its closed position. Putting the rear gunner's 1919 back where I had it before, just plugs right in. This is a mix of ECA and Dragon. The mount itself is the 3050 mount that was developed during World War II, but these were still in service during the Vietnam War timeframe, as were 1919s to a limited degree. The 1919 is a cast resin copy of the Dragon 1919. As I referenced in another video, the Dragon 1919 is probably the best example out there for a Browning 1919 in this scale. However, the Dragon unit was upgraded with a new barrel shroud, with the conical flash suppressor, as well as the safety lock bar, and a few other small subtle scratch built details that were added to it. The front end, as well as the safety lock bar, and not to mention the belt feed mechanism system that we have over there, are a detail upgrade set for the Dragon 1919 that are sold on the ECA catalog. And again, I go into more information about that in those other videos. Regardless, you get to see what the unit looks like fully painted and weathered outdoors. And we have the appropriate detailing on the barrel shroud, as well as the barrel detailing underneath. Now it decides to go out of focus, of course. With the unit back in focus, you get to see the conical flash suppressor in better light, along with the wrench slits right there on the front booster section. And again, it's just a really cool rendition of the 1919. That's a post-war variant, but for the V100 over here, it's definitely appropriate. On the antenna base, this is the post-war US AV antenna base that I referenced before. It is made out of cast rubber, so that the piece does have some flex to it. The cast rubber part is made out of an HD 3D printed master, so even though it is cast, it does have all the detail fidelity of the 3D print that I designed in CAD. We also have here the rubber cup that covers this thing up when the radio is not in use, and the rubber piece is made out of real rubber, so again, nice accuracy, nice detail fidelity, and no need to paint because rubber gonna rubber. This takes us to probably the one aspect of this build that did require the most amount of research and development on. And if there was ever something that was made with love, it was the T50 turret. This thing was a blast to work on from beginning to end. The funny thing is, originally I actually developed the M73s well in advance of the turret, and then I just basically built the turret around the M73s. The M73s themselves were also a fun little thing to detail out. I remember working on them actually on Halloween on one year, and I was periodically having to take breaks to give kids their candy, but regardless, that's just what you see presently. So the unit is fully in detail inside and out, and as I referenced in the other videos, this thing has as many details as a single print as humanly possible on both inside and out. So even though the unit is very ornately detailed, it is also easy to assemble. And before, these pieces looked great in the boot setting as well as in the shop, and of course outdoors definitely does not detract from that at all. Up one more time to look at the interior, where we got the rubber eye cup, the elevator arm, as well as those really cool backrests. From the turret takes to the bow hatches, and again, these are ECA catalog items. What's cool about them is that they are functional in that they open and close, but the counterbalance spring system is also fully functional as it is on the real unit and works the exact same way. As I mentioned before, there was a bit of reverse engineering required in order to figure out exactly how that works. And once you figure it out, it's actually a really slick system. On the bottom over here, we have fuel breathers, and what's cool is that they are on the very top of the vehicle, which, remember, the vehicle is amphibious, so having the fuel breathers up here was a really smart idea. There are two more on the opposite side, and if you've seen the video walk-around that I did on the real one, you can see exactly how everything plumbs together on the real unit when I'm filming on the interior portion. Regardless, on this one here, they are functional, and again, the counterbalance spring only kicks in when the hatch hits the midpoint, and now the springs are under pressure, to which then you could lock them onto that little latch, and it keeps them in the open state and prevents this hatch from plunking onto your head, which is something that would be greatly appreciated. Here you can see the rubber pads on the inside. These are real rubber made from, again, 3D printed masters. They drop directly into place and they just look so realistic because, again, of the material that was utilized. These hatches here, you kind of have to like close them both at the same time for some reason. They just like scissor together, but once they are closed, they stay in that state. And that's all there is to mention about the detail and the features. This takes us to the paintwork. The paintwork is all done with exterior flat latex house paints. This is the same type of paint that I utilize on all of my builds, small and large. And it's applied with the spray gun and the airbrush, depending on the location that is getting the paint. For my paint, it's my own custom mix of very dark olive drab. Bear in mind, during the 1950s and 1960s timeframe, and even into the 70s, the US military was going very dark with their shades of OD. You do have several options and variations available on how to paint these things. As you know, like everything else, there's a multitude of different options out there. But for this model here, I went with the following format. The model also has some washes on it to give it the look that you see here, and it just came out absolutely excellent. It's one of those things that you really do appreciate when the thing is out in the natural light like you see here. For the weathering work, I utilized my usual techniques, which would include airbrushing, dry brushing, and Tamiya panel line accent, and all of those left for the end result that we see here, which in my opinion came out absolutely perfect. This is also part of the reason why I build 135s, is to keep my painting and weathering techniques honed in, and also to try and experiment on different types of techniques, which eventually trickle their way up to the 1/6 scale counterparts, like the one you see presently. This is actually the first time I've incorporated many of the paints that were utilized on this build here in 1/6 scale, and again, now that I've practiced them in the 135s, the 1/6 scale counterpart really did come out better because of that. Something else about this model that is noteworthy is with the markings. Of course, being a 1/6 scale, you're not going to go with water slide decals, and you're going to go with a set of stencils. The stencils are homemade, and stenciling markings is something I've been doing on my 1/6 scale projects for many years, so that's nothing new. However, what makes this project unique is that this is the first time I utilize a Cricut machine for the use of my stencils. In the past, I would have to go ahead and utilize an X-Acto knife to carefully cut and carve out every one of these little characters and numbers, but with this method I utilized the machine and it did everything in a very clean and crisp format. In the video where I go over the application of the markings, I really show this to better effect. Regardless, the Cricut machine is definitely worth the investment, and I cannot recommend it enough. If you're doing any sort of paint stenciling on scales from 1/16 to 1/6 and larger, the Cricut machine is going to be a very good asset indeed. The Cricut machine was used to basically make everything that you see here, and it came out far better than if I was able to do it the old-fashioned way. Although it was still doable, of course, as I've done in the past, but, you know, the Cricut machine is definitely the next leg up. However, the one marking that was not applied with the Cricut was the Underdog logo. This I wanted to do the old-fashioned way by hand, and, you know, it just has that more hand-painted feel to it, which is definitely something that would be more appropriate compared to going with a stencil route. And that's really all there is to mention about this build. And this brings us to the announcement that I was alluding to earlier in the video, and it's also something that I briefly mentioned in the very first project announcement video for this project. As I mentioned before, this model here is a scratch-built one-off. However, part of the reason why I built this model here was I needed a dry run to test out all of the various detail components that I was designing for the V100. Why would I do that, you may ask? Well, one, I had this one here and I was working on, but that was really advantageous because after I saw the real V100 Armored car, me and another designer decided that this is something really cool and that perhaps we could go ahead and make a kit of it. That's right. This entire time, this project here was being used as a dry run for the new 1/6 scale EastCoastArmory.com full kit of the M706 V100 Armored car. You can see thumbnails of that project popping up on screen right now, and at the time of filming this, the CAD files are mostly done for the hull. Keep in mind, I already have the remainder of the hull fittings, and I designed it to fit on that example. So, we are really coming close to the point where I can actually fully release this kit as a pre-order on the ECA catalog, as well as also have it in my possession so I can build one and, go along with the construction of it. And of course, that'll be the subject matter of its own build series of videos. As I mentioned before, this homebrew example is made out of 1/8" thick styrene panels that were hand cut and hand shaped to give you the shape of the hull. The ECA counterpart is going to be made out of 3D print. As for how it's going to be printed, as well as the media, well, that's something that's going to be announced in an upcoming video. But regardless, this one here really was a dry run for that other example. And just as a clarification, I was actually working with another designer on that project before, I was literally like a week before this fellow here who had this model reached out to me, and I was able to obtain this model. So with this one in hand, I was basically just fleshing out the one required for the kit while the whole CAD files were being worked in tandem. So I've been really biting my tongue on this one for 2 years now, but it feels so good to finally make the announcement that yes, ECA will be making the V100 as a 1/6 scale kit. And here is something that I'm pretty sure a lot of people did not expect me to do in this video, but give a nice cameo to another one of my other builds, specifically one of my armored cars. Next to the V100, right here on the right, you see my 1/6 scale German SDKFZ 222 armored car. This model here was another subject of its own build series and can be found on this channel, and this really was probably one of the hardest models I've ever had to build. Just like with the other one, this is technically a scratch build. I like to call it an assisted scratch build, but I go into more information on the background in the other videos. But regardless, the reason why I have the two here is really to compare the new and the old school way of manufacturing things, or how I detail my models. So the 222 was really the pinnacle of doing things the old-fashioned way, where everything you see on the model is either made out of cast resin or it's made out of formed metal. The units were all handmade, or I should say the parts that went into the cast resin parts, the masters were all handmade using old school techniques, using mills, lathes, drill presses, old school fabrication at its finest. The V100, on the other hand, that's all the opposite. It's all newfangled CAD and computer stuff that's used to make the detailed parts, and then everything is 3D printed. However, the 222 is a more thorough model in that, unlike the V100, the 222 has a full fighting compartment interior. The V100, on the other hand, it is an exterior model exclusively. Both models here have steering, only the 222 is more complex because, LOL German, the 222 has quad wheel steering, while the V100 only has a simple front-end type steering conventional system. The 222 model, on the other hand, because of the suspension being both using spring and shock absorbers, has a functional suspension, as opposed to the V100 that has a fixed suspension, like I mentioned before. It is really nice to get the two outside, side by side. The 222 has not seen the light of day since I filmed the outdoor video all those years ago, in the same place no less, so having the opportunity to get the two on camera is definitely a nice way to round off this video. Also, one other thing that's noteworthy, I have 3 1/6 scale armored cars in my collection. Obviously, the V100 is the newest. The 222 is the one that follows, but there's one other that is currently missing, and that's something that's currently being cleaned up and fixed up right now, and that is my 1/6 scale German Puma armored car, the Walkaround, but that's something I'm going to be mentioning in more depth when that model is ready for its debut on the ECA channel. Regardless, you can see the 2 1/6 scale armored cars in my collection right here, side by side. One last thing I do want to mention is that although the 222 Armored car is a much older design compared to the V100, the V100 does have some lineage to this vehicle in that in the 1950s timeframe, some of the very first armored cars that were designed by Cadillac Gage, specifically some of the early prototypes, were heavily influenced by many of the German armored cars from World War II, specifically the 222 and the 223. 20 years later, the V100 came out, and you can see that in 20 years' time, just how much the design of armored cars have evolved from the 1930s. In the end, I had an absolute blast working on this model here. This was really the first post-World War II 1/6 scale model I've ever built. Technically, I've done another post-World War II model, but that was a Sherman tank painted for the Korean War, and although it's not World War II, it's basically World War II adjacent. This project over here, however, was something completely new, completely fresh, completely different from my normal working routines. So I had a real fun time working on this one, doing all the design work, the reference gathering, and even just the execution. This build came out to be nearly perfect. I had an absolute blast, and chances are really good I'm going to be having a few other V100s in my collection, not to mention perhaps some other post-World War II and Vietnam era 1/6 scale projects that are in the pipeline. But of course, more on that is to come. And with that, that wraps up this project wrap-up video for the 1/6 scale M706 V100 Armored car. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a fantastic way to keep in the loop of new posted content, being the other project update videos for this project that have been posted since the start, or the other smaller scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted on this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There you'll see photographs of both of the models that you see here, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel previously. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.